The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it haunts. It clings to the windows of our Queen Anne home like 1,000 translucent ghosts, blurring the view of the Space Needle until everything is just a smudge of grey against a charcoal sky. I've lived in this city for 30 years, and I used to find the sound of the drizzle on the slate roof comforting, like a rhythmic lullaby. But today, the rain feels like needles. It feels like the world is trying to wash away something that simply won't come clean. It started with a piece of paper, such a small, inconsequential thing to carry the weight of a death sentence. I was cleaning Julian's guest suite, the one he and Sophie have been staying in since their pipes burst in their condo downtown, when I found it. It was tucked into the side pocket of his leather briefcase, a folded sheet from a lab near Lake Union. I shouldn't have looked. I was just reaching for a stray receipt, trying to be the helpful mother-in-law, the invisible force that keeps this house running. But my eyes caught the words, positive, and infectious disease panel. I remember my heart stopping, not slowing down, but stopping entirely, as if my chest had suddenly turned to stone. The medical jargon blurred, but the implications were a deafening roar in my ears. Julian, my daughter's husband, the man we welcomed into this family with open arms and a vintage bottle of wine 3 years ago, was sick. And it wasn't a cold. It wasn't the flu. It was something that suggested a life he had been living in the shadows, far away from the bright, suburban perfection of our Sunday brunches. I stood there, paralyzed by the smell of Julian's expensive cologne, something woody and sharp, which now smelled like decay. My mind went straight to Sophie, my sweet, fragile Sophie, who was currently at her gallery opening, probably smiling and holding a glass of Chardonnay, completely unaware that her world was rotting from the inside out. I had to tell her. I had to protect her. But before I could even draw a breath to scream, the door clicked open. It wasn't Julian. It was Arthur. My husband stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the hallway light. Arthur has always been a man of ironed shirts and ironed emotions. As a high-stakes real estate lawyer, he deals in facts and leverage. He looked at the paper in my trembling hand, then at my face, and his expression didn't shatter. It hardened. There was no shock in his eyes, only a cold, calculated irritation. "Put that down, Clara," he said. His voice was like a scalpel, cutting through the silence. "Arthur, look at this. Julian, he's sick. We have to call Sophie. We have to get her to a doctor immediately. If he's done this," my voice was a frantic whisper, a bird trapped in a cage. Arthur didn't move toward me to offer comfort. Instead, he took a step back, as if the very air I breathed was now toxic. "I already know," he said flatly. The room tilted. "You knew? How? For how long?" "It doesn't matter," Arthur snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp cruelty. "What matters is that this house is now a biohazard. Julian was careless. He brought his filth under our roof. And you, Clara, you've been touching his things. You've been in this room for 20 minutes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small canister of disinfectant spray. Before I could move, he pulled the trigger. A fine chemical mist hit my face, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs with the scent of artificial lemons and bleach. "Don't touch the doorknob," Arthur commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Go to the guest bathroom, now. Strip your clothes off and put them in a plastic bag. I've already set out the hospital-grade soap. Use it. Every inch of you." "Arthur, what are you doing? I'm your wife. Our daughter is in danger," I cried, the tears finally breaking through the sting of the spray. "Our daughter is being handled," he said, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not guilt, but a frantic sort of panic that he quickly suppressed. But you are a liability now. You're always so messy, Clara. Always touching things you shouldn't. From this moment on, you don't touch anything in this house. Not the counters, not the silverware, not the remote. Nothing. You stay in the sunroom suite. I will bring you what you need. Do not make me repeat myself. That was the beginning of the sterile cage. For the next 48 hours, I became a ghost in my own home. Arthur moved with a terrifying efficiency. He draped plastic sheets over the furniture in the main living area. He wore blue latex gloves, even when he was just reading the morning paper. Every time I had to use the hallway to get to the bathroom, he followed behind me with a bottle of Clorox wipes, feverishly scrubbing the air I had moved through. The psychological weight of it was suffocating. Every time I looked at him, hoping for a sign of the man I had married 35 years ago, I only saw a man obsessed with hygiene. Or so it seemed. He treated me like a leper. When he brought me food, sandwiches on paper plates with plastic forks, he slid the tray across the floor like I was a prisoner in a high-security ward. "Arthur, please talk to me," I begged through the glass door of the sunroom. The rain was drumming harder now, a relentless grey curtain. "Where is Sophie? Why isn't she answering her phone?" "She's staying with Julian at a private clinic for his exhaustion," Arthur lied, his eyes not meeting mine. He was wearing a fresh silk tie, but I noticed something. A small, red patch of skin peeking out from beneath his collar. It looked angry. It looked just like the descriptions I had searched for on my laptop late at night when the Wi-Fi was still working. I sat on the wicker chair in the sunroom, staring at my hands. They were raw from the harsh soap he made me use. The internal monologue in my head was a fractured loop. Why was he so calm about Julian? Why was he punishing me? I felt a deep, hollow sense of shame, as if I truly was the one who was dirty. He had shifted the narrative so quickly that I found myself apologizing for breathing. I remembered the early years in Seattle. We were young, and the city felt like a playground of possibilities. Arthur was a rising star, and I was happy to be the wind beneath his wings. We used to walk through Pike Place Market, sharing a bag of cherries, our fingers stained red, laughing without a care for germs or shadows. Now, that memory felt like a story about two different people. The man outside the sunroom door was a stranger. He was a sentinel of a cold, white world, where love had been replaced by a frantic need for containment. Julian returned to the house 3 days later. I saw him from the sunroom window. He looked gaunt, his usual arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. He walked into the house, and to my horror, Arthur didn't spray him. Arthur didn't make him strip. Instead, Arthur placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. A gloved hand, yes, but the gesture was one of brotherhood, of a shared secret. They stood in the foyer, whispering. I pressed my ear against the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Is it handled?" Julian asked, his voice thin. "The records are sealed," Arthur replied. "The firm took care of the lab. But she knows, Julian. Clara saw the panel." "What are we going to do with her?" Julian's voice drifted up, laced with a cowardice that made me want to retch. "She's staying where she is," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hum. "As long as she's contaminated in her own mind, she won't go to the press. She won't go to Sophie. I'll keep her contained. It's for her own safety, after all. At her age, she's so easily confused." I sank to the floor, the cold tile chilling my bones. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This wasn't about Julian's health. This wasn't about protecting Sophie. This was a conspiracy of silence. Arthur wasn't afraid of the virus. He was afraid of the truth. and he was using my own home as a psychological prison to keep me quiet. I looked out at the Seattle skyline, the grey mist swallowing the buildings. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of bleach and lies. My husband, the man I had trusted with my life, was treating me like a contagion to hide the filth he and Julian were drowning in. The nyuk-nya, the sheer humiliation of being told I was too dirty to touch a spoon, while they stood in the foyer sharing the spoils of their deception, was a flame that began to flicker in the dark corners of my mind. I am 59 years old. I am a mother. I am a woman who has read 1,000 stories of tragedy and triumph, but nothing in those books prepared me for the reality of being an outcast in my own castle. I watched Arthur through the glass as he meticulously polished the silver banister, his movements robotic and obsessive. He looked at me for a split second, and the contempt in his gaze was so pure it felt like a slap. "Don't look at me like that, Clara," he mouthed through the glass. "You should be grateful I'm keeping you safe." Safe. The word felt like a joke. I wasn't safe. I was buried alive. But as the rain turned into a downpour, washing the grime of the city into the Puget Sound, a tiny, sharp thought pierced through my despair. If they were so afraid of me being dirty, then I would become the very thing they feared. I would become the infection that destroys their perfect, sterile lie. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the cold glass, listening to the ghosts of the rain. I thought of Sophie. I had to reach her. But for now, I was just a woman in a sunroom, surrounded by plastic sheets and the smell of lemons, waiting for the first crack in the glass. The silence of the house was punctuated only by the hum of the air purifier Arthur had installed in the hallway. It was a constant, buzzing reminder that I was a pollutant. I thought of the wedding, Sophie's wedding, the white lace, the lilies, the promise of a bright future. How had we moved from that light into this clinical darkness? The internal monologue of my life was changing its tune. No longer was I the submissive wife, the one who apologized for taking up space. I was becoming an observer. I was watching the way Arthur's hands shook when he thought I wasn't looking. I was watching the way Julian avoided the light. They were the ones who were rotting, not me. But as the night fell over Seattle, and the lights of the city began to twinkle through the mist, I realized I was entirely alone. My daughter was somewhere out there, being lied to by the two men she loved most. And I was here, in my sterile cage, forbidden from even touching the walls. The collapse was complete. The world I knew was gone, replaced by a cold, grey reality where the only thing that felt real was the burning need to survive the night. I stayed awake, watching the shadows of the rain dance on the ceiling. I felt like a soldier behind enemy lines. I didn't have a weapon, and I didn't have a map. All I had was the memory of the red patch on Arthur's neck and the lab report hidden, I hoped, somewhere they hadn't found yet. Tomorrow, the rain would continue. Tomorrow, Arthur would bring me another paper plate. But tomorrow, I would start looking for the key to this cage, because no amount of disinfectant can wash away a mother's instinct, and no amount of silence can kill the truth once it has started to breathe. I am Clara, and I am not dirty. I am the only one in this house who is still clean. But as the clock in the hallway struck midnight, and I heard Arthur's heavy footsteps retreating to our master bedroom, the bedroom I was no longer allowed to enter, I felt a wave of such intense loneliness that I almost succumbed to the urge to scream. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. It was a metallic, real taste. It reminded me that I was still alive. The rain against the glass sounded like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. And for the first time in 3 days, I didn't feel like a leper. I felt like a storm, And storms don't care about sterile cages. Storms just break everything until the sky is clear again. I looked at the plastic-covered sofa in the hallway, the way it shimmered in the dim light like a shroud. Arthur thought he could bury me in here. He thought he could use my fear of being a bad wife or a careless mother against me. But he forgot one thing. I taught literature for 30 years. I know how the villain's story ends. They always underestimate the one they think is too weak to fight back. I lay down on the small daybed in the sunroom, pulling the thin, scratchy blanket up to my chin. The smell of lemons was everywhere, but beneath it, I could still smell the wet earth from the garden. Life was still out there. The truth was still out there. I just had to wait for the rain to stop. But in Seattle, the rain never really stops. It just waits for you to lower your guard. And I would never lower mine again. Not for Arthur, not for Julian, not for the lie of our perfect family. The sterile cage was my prison for tonight, but tomorrow it would be my fortress. The internal monologue shifted one last time before I fell into a fitful sleep. I am not the contagion. I am the cure. I drifted off to the sound of the ghosts on the glass, their translucent fingers tapping a rhythm of survival. Clara was gone. The woman who stayed in the sunroom was someone else. Someone who was learning to breathe in the scent of bleach without choking. Someone who was waiting for the glass to shatter. And as the city of Seattle slept beneath its charcoal blanket, the first crack appeared. Not in the glass, but in the silence. From the floor above, I heard a sound that Arthur hadn't planned for. A cough. A deep, wet, rattling cough that didn't sound like exhaustion. It sounded like the end. The morning light in Seattle is never truly light. It's a filtered, bruised luminescence that struggles to penetrate the heavy mist hanging over Elliott Bay. When I woke up on the sunroom daybed, my neck stiff from the thin pillow and my skin feeling tight from the previous night's chemical scrubbing, I felt like a specimen under a microscope. I could hear the muffled sounds of the house waking up, the distant hum of the espresso machine, the clinking of china that I was no longer allowed to touch, and the low, rhythmic thud of the air purifier. My world had shrunk to the size of this glass-walled room, a beautiful cage where I was the only thing considered unholy. Arthur appeared at the door precisely at 8 o'clock. He was already fully dressed in a charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, looking every bit the pillar of the legal community. He didn't open the door. He slid a tray through the small gap he had created by installing a temporary door sweep. A paper plate held a dry piece of toast and a hard-boiled egg. Beside it sat a plastic cup of lukewarm tea. It was the meal of a prisoner, served with the clinical detachment of a scientist handling a dangerous pathogen. "Sophie called," Arthur said, his voice vibrating through the glass. "She's staying at the downtown condo to oversee the pipe repairs. She doesn't need to see you like this, Clara. Not while you're so agitated. It would only distress her." "I'm not agitated, Arthur. I'm discarded," I replied, my voice raspy. I didn't reach for the food. I just stared at him, watching the way he kept a precise 3-foot distance from the doorframe. "You told her I was sick, didn't you? You told her I was the one with the problem." "I told her you were undergoing a period of intense quarantine due to a potential exposure," he said, his tone as smooth as polished marble. "Technically, it isn't a lie. You were in Julian's room. You touched his things. In this house, we prioritize the health of the family, Clara. Even if you've grown careless in your old age." As he spoke, he reached up to adjust his silk tie, and I saw it again. The red, angry patch of skin on his neck, peeking out like a secret he couldn't quite keep buried. It wasn't just a rash. It was a mark of something much deeper, something that mirrored the decay I had seen on Julian's lab report. But Arthur moved with such practiced grace, such utter conviction in his own purity, that for a moment I almost doubted my own eyes. How could a man so sick act so superior? How could he spray me with bleach while he carried the same poison in his veins? When he finally walked away, the silence he left behind felt heavier than the rain. To distract myself from the hunger and the growing sense of unreality, I closed my eyes and let my mind wander back to 3 years ago. The memory of Sophie's wedding at St. James Cathedral was a vivid, technicolor contrast to this grey purgatory. I remembered the way the light had filtered through the stained glass, splashing deep blues and crimsons onto the stone floor. I remembered the scent of 1,000 lilies, their fragrance so thick it felt like you could breathe in the purity. I was the proud mother of the bride, wearing a champagne-coloured silk gown that had cost more than my first car. I remembered the way Arthur had looked that day, the embodiment of success and integrity, walking Sophie down the aisle with a tear in his eye that I actually believed was real. And Julian. God, Julian had looked like a prince, an architect of dreams, everyone called him. He had stood at the altar with a smile that promised Sophie the world. I remember thinking that we had finally achieved the American dream, the beautiful daughter, the brilliant son-in-law, the legacy of a perfect, untouchable family. During the reception at the Fairmont Olympic, Arthur had stood up to give a toast. He spoke about family values, about the sanctity of the home, and about how a man's greatest achievement was the protection of his lineage. Everyone had clapped. I had leaned my head on Arthur's shoulder, feeling like the luckiest woman in Seattle. Now, that memory felt like a cruel joke, a theatrical performance where the lead actors were all monsters in disguise. Julian hadn't been an architect of dreams. He was an architect of shadows. And Arthur wasn't a protector. He was a jailer. The contrast between the white lace of Sophie's dress and the plastic sheets now covering my hallway was a physical pain in my chest. I remembered the way Julian had hugged me at the wedding, his scent woody and expensive. Now that same scent was associated with the laboratory report and the sterile smell of the sunroom. The en-yuk nya, the absolute crushing humiliation, wasn't just in the paper plates or the bleach. It was in the realization that my entire life had been a lie, and I was the only one who hadn't been in on the secret. Throughout the afternoon, the rain turned into a relentless downpour, the kind that makes the hills of Seattle feel like they might slide into the sea. I watched Julian through the hallway glass as he moved about the kitchen. He looked thinner than he had just a few months ago, his face sallow. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, but he moved with a fragility that suggested his bones were made of glass. I saw him reach for a glass of water, and then I saw Arthur enter the room. I waited for the spray. I waited for the wipes. I waited for Arthur to berate him for touching the counter, but it never happened. Arthur simply stood beside him, talking in a low, intimate tone. They looked like two soldiers in a bunker, bonded by a trauma I wasn't allowed to understand. Julian said something, and Arthur actually laughed. A dry, rattling sound that ended in a sharp, wet cough. Arthur caught my gaze through the sunroom glass. His laughter vanished, replaced by that cold, surgical mask. He walked to the door and tapped on it with a gloved finger. "Julian is resting, Clara. Don't stare at him. It's unseemly," Arthur said through the intercom he had recently activated. "He's been through a lot. Unlike you, he's actually doing the work to keep this family together." "Keeping the family together? Arthur, he's the one who brought this in. He's the one who's sick," I screamed, slamming my hands against the glass. "He is a victim of circumstances," Arthur replied, his voice eerily calm. "You, on the other hand, are a victim of your own hysteria. If you hadn't gone through his things, we could have managed this quietly." But you had to be the martyr, didn't you? You had to be the one to save everyone. Look where it's gotten you. The injustice of it was a physical weight, like I was being buried under a mountain of wet Seattle soil. They were the ones who had cheated, who had lived recklessly, who had brought a literal plague into our sanctuary. Yet I was the one in the cage. I was the one whose presence was considered a hazard. I spent the rest of the day pacing the sunroom, feeling the edges of my sanity beginning to fray. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I looked old. My hair was a mess of grey tangles, and my eyes were rimmed with red. I looked like the crazy woman Arthur wanted everyone to think I was. I thought of my books, my beloved Bronte and Dickens, all of them sitting on the mahogany shelves in the library, now forbidden to me. I was a literature teacher who had lost her story. I was a character in a Gothic novel, locked in the attic while the madmen ran the estate. When evening came, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement of Queen Anne, creating a shimmering, distorted version of the world. I saw a car pull into the driveway. It was Sophie's Volvo. My heart leaped. I rushed to the glass, pressing my face against it, waving my arms. "Sophie, Sophie, I'm here!" Sophie got out of the car. She looked tired, her beautiful face etched with worry. She started toward the front door, but Arthur met her on the porch. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Arthur's hand go to her arm, gently steering her away from the sunroom side of the house. He was whispering in her ear, his posture that of a grieving but stoic father. Sophie looked toward the sunroom window. For a second, our eyes met, but there was no recognition in her gaze, only a profound, heartbreaking fear. She didn't wave back. She didn't blow a kiss. She looked away, as if she were looking at a tragic accident she couldn't bear to witness. "Mom?" I heard her voice, faint and distorted, as Arthur led her inside through the mudroom entrance. Is she getting any better?" "It's a slow process, honey." Arthur's voice drifted through the vents. "The doctors say the chemical exposure and the shock have caused a bit of a psychotic break. She thinks everyone is sick. She thinks the house is contaminated. It's best to keep your distance. For her sake, and for yours." I collapsed onto the wicker chair, the air leaving my lungs in a long, silent sob. He was erasing me. He was using the very thing I had discovered to paint me as the one who was insane. He was turning my daughter, my only child, the girl I had raised with every ounce of my soul, against me by using her own fear as a weapon. The enhuknya of that moment was deeper than anything I had ever felt. It was a spiritual violation, to be seen by your own child as a monster, as a hazard, while the real monsters stood by her side and whispered sweet lies into her ear, was a pain that exceeded the boundaries of the physical. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life I was no longer allowed to lead. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of my family having dinner in the dining room, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the normalcy of it all, the red patch on Arthur's neck burned in my mind like a beacon. He was sick. He was just as sick as Julian. Why was he hiding it? Why was he protecting Julian? And who was he seeing in the shadows of the city? Arthur was a man of routines. The Thursday night client dinners, the Saturday morning golf trips that never seemed to result in a lower handicap. I had never questioned him. I had trusted him with the blind devotion of a woman who believed that a good life was built on silence and compromise. Now the silence was a deafening roar. I looked at the wicker table in the sunroom. On it was a small plastic bottle of hand sanitizer that Arthur had left for me. I picked it up, feeling the smooth, cold plastic. It was a symbol of his control, of his sterile world. I thought of the red cherries from Pike Place Market, the juice staining our fingers. We weren't sterile then. We were alive. The rattling cough came again from the hallway, followed by a heavy silence. I realized then that Arthur wasn't just afraid of me telling Sophie about Julian. He was afraid of me looking too closely at him. He had created this quarantine not to keep the house clean, but to keep my eyes off the cracks in his own armor. The bleach, the plastic, the gloves. It was all a massive, clinical distraction. He was projecting his own filth onto me so that he could feel pure. I stood up and walked to the glass door. I didn't slam my hands against it this time. I didn't scream. I just stood there, a shadow against the city lights, and I watched them. I watched the way Arthur leaned in to pour Sophie more wine. I watched the way Julian picked at his food with a trembling hand. They thought I was defeated. They thought that by taking away my silver spoons and my mahogany shelves, they had taken away my power. But they had forgotten that I had spent my life teaching the great tragedies. I knew that the greatest falls always came from the highest towers of pride. Arthur had built a tower of bleach and lies, but it was sitting on a foundation of rot. I looked down at the paper plate on the floor, the toast cold and uneaten. I picked it up and threw it into the plastic trash bag Arthur had provided. I didn't need his food. I needed the truth. And as the Seattle rain continued its relentless assault on the glass, I realized that the sterile cage was the perfect place for a revolution. In here, there were no distractions. There was only the sound of my own breathing and the growing certainty that before this storm was over, I would touch every single thing in this house. I would touch the mahogany shelves. I would touch the silver banister. I would touch the truth. The Enhuk Nya was a flame, and that flame was turning into a furnace. I thought of Sophie's white dress, now probably tucked away in a cedar chest somewhere, a relic of a dead dream. I wouldn't let her live in this grey mist forever. I would pull her out of it, even if I had to break every glass wall in this house to do it. I sat back down on the daybed, my mind racing through the fragments of information I had. The lab report, the red patch, the secret whispers, the private clinic. Somewhere in this house there was a key, not a physical one, but a piece of evidence that would shatter Arthur's sterile world. He thought he could manage me. He thought he could use my age and my fragility as a weapon. But Arthur had forgotten who I was before I became his wife. I was a girl from the rain-soaked streets of Ballard who knew how to find her way in the dark. As the clock struck 2 in the morning and the house fell into a deep, uneasy slumber, I heard a new sound. It wasn't a cough. It was the sound of the front door opening and closing very softly. I crept to the sunroom window and looked down into the driveway. Through the fog, I saw a figure moving toward a dark sedan parked at the curb. It wasn't Julian. It was Arthur. He was moving with a frantic, hurried pace, his collar turned up against the rain. He got into the car and drove away, leaving the house in Queen Anne to the ghosts and the bleach. Where was he going at 2 in the morning? The internal monologue in my head was no longer a fractured loop. It was a sharp, clear line. Arthur was a man of secrets, and tonight, the master of the house had left the gates unguarded. I looked at the glass door of the sunroom. The lock was a simple one, designed more for psychological restraint than physical security. I am Clara. And tonight, I am going to touch everything. The rain against the glass sounded like an invitation. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my raw hands teeve. I was a prisoner, yes. I was an outcast, yes. But the monsters had left the cage open, and the storm was just beginning. I took a deep breath of the lemon-scented air and reached for the handle. It was cold. It was metallic. and for the first time in 3 days, it felt like the truth. The lock on the sunroom door clicked back into place before I could even wrap my fingers around the cold brass handle. I froze, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I hadn't even stepped out of my glass cage before Arthur returned. He hadn't driven away into the night to escape. He had merely been moving his car, creating a charade of departure to see if I would bolt. He stood on the other side of the glass, the charcoal sky of Seattle silhouetting his frame, making him look like a monstrous shadow carved out of the mist. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, with a cold, surgical precision that was far more terrifying than rage. "You're proving my point, Clara," he said, his voice amplified through the intercom system. "You're unstable. You're erratic. You're a danger to the integrity of this home. I tried to give you the sunroom, a place with light and a view, but you simply cannot be trusted to maintain the boundaries of your quarantine." "Arthur, I saw you leave. I saw the car. Where were you going at 2 in the morning?" I demanded, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "And that patch on your neck. I know what it is. I know you're hiding the same rot Julian is carrying." For the first time in 35 years, I saw the mask of the prestigious Queen Anne lawyer slip. A flash of pure, unadulterated venom crossed his face before he smoothed it back into a chillingly calm expression. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh pair of latex gloves, snapping them onto his hands with a sound like a gunshot. "The sunroom is no longer sufficient," he stated, his tone devoid of any humanity. "Your presence here is too close to the main ventilation. Sophie is coming back tomorrow to help Julian with his recovery, and I won't have her exposed to your delusions. You're moving, Clara, to the lower level." "The basement?" I gasped, the word feeling like a mouthful of ash. "Arthur, you can't be serious. You're burying me alive." "I'm keeping the family safe," he replied, and then he opened the door just wide enough to point a heavy-duty flashlight directly into my eyes, blinding me. "Move, now. Don't touch the walls. Don't touch the banister. If you touch anything, I will personally scrub this entire house with acid." The descent into the basement was the most nuknya, the most profoundly humiliating moment of my life. I walked through my own home like a condemned criminal, Arthur following 3 paces behind me, spraying a mist of disinfectant into the air I had just occupied. He didn't even let me grab a sweater. I was in my thin nightgown, my bare feet echoing on the hardwood floors I had once picked out with so much love. We passed the library, the kitchen with its marble islands, the foyer where Sophie's graduation photos hung. All of it now felt like a foreign country, a place where I was a trespasser. The basement in our home was finished, a high-end space with a home theatre and a laundry suite. But to me, it was a tomb. The air was different down there, heavier, smelling of damp concrete, and the aggressive artificial scent of the laundry detergent Arthur used in excessive amounts. He ushered me into the large utility room adjacent to the furnace, where he had set up a cot and a small card table. "This is your space now," he said, standing at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to step onto the carpet. "The Wi-Fi has been disabled down here. I've left you a few jugs of water and some protein bars. I will bring you a hot meal once a day. Do not attempt to come up the stairs. I've installed a motion sensor. If it goes off, I'll be forced to call the psychiatric crisis team. I've already prepared the paperwork, Clara. One word from me, and you'll be in a state facility before the rain stops." He turned off the main lights, leaving me in the dim, flickering glow of the furnace indicator. The door at the top of the stairs closed with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. I was alone in the frozen silence of the dark. I sat on the cot, my body shivering from the damp cold of the Seattle night. The internal monologue in my head was no longer a storm. It was a desperate, clawing search for truth. Why the basement? Why now? As the hours ticked by, marked only by the hum of the water heater and the distant rattle of the rain on the basement windows, I began to realize that the basement wasn't just about my hysteria. It was about proximity. From my position near the furnace, I realized I could hear the pipes. This house was a marvel of modern architecture, but its acoustics were its greatest flaw. I leaned my head against the cold metal of the air duct, and that's when I heard them. Julian's voice was the first to filter through the vents. He wasn't in the guest room, he was in Arthur's study, directly above me. "I can't keep doing this, Arthur," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a rattling cough. "The fatigue is getting worse. If Sophie sees the medication, if she sees the labs—" "Sophie sees what I tell her to see." Arthur's voice was a low, commanding rumble. "The clinic in Bellevue is under my retainer. They've listed your condition as a severe case of Epstein-Barr. It's a respectable illness, Julian. It explains the weight loss, the lethargy. It buys us time." "And Clara? She's not going to stay quiet forever." "Clara is a broken woman," Arthur said, and I could almost hear the cruel smile in his voice. "She's in the basement, convinced she's a biohazard. By the time I'm done with her, she'll be grateful for the silence. She's served her purpose, Julian. She provided the domestic veneer I needed for 30 years. But the facade is changing now. We have to protect our interests, our shared interests." I pressed my ear harder against the vent, the cold metal biting into my skin. Shared interests. The phrase was a jagged glass shard in my mind. It wasn't just Julian's sickness. Arthur was speaking with a familiarity, a chilling intimacy that went far beyond a father-in-law protecting his son-in-law. They weren't just bonded by a secret. They were bonded by the same shadow. The realization washed over me like the icy waters of the Puget Sound. Arthur's client dinners, his golf trips, his obsessive need for a sterile home. It was all a defense mechanism against a life he had been sharing with Julian. They were mirrors of each other, two men of status and wealth who had found a common ground in the dark underbelly of the city, and now the consequences of that life were eating them from the inside out. The enhuknya I had felt earlier was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Arthur wasn't afraid of me being dirty. He was afraid of me being a witness to his own filth. He had turned the basement into a grave for my voice. I looked around the utility room. In the dim light, I saw the laundry chute. It was a narrow opening designed for the convenience of dropping linens from the upper floors directly into the sorting bins. It was too small for me to climb through, but it was an ear to the rest of the house. I dragged the card table over and stood on it, peering up into the dark tunnel of the chute. I heard Sophie's footsteps. They were light, hesitant. She was upstairs now, back from the gallery. "Dad? Where's Mum?" Her voice was a fragile thread. "I went to the sunroom, but it's empty. Everything is covered in plastic, Dad. It looks like a crime scene." "She had a bad night, Sophie." Arthur's voice was suddenly full of faux tenderness. "She became aggressive. She tried to leave, to wander the streets in the rain. I had to move her to the lower suite where she can't hurt herself. The doctors say she needs sensory deprivation to calm her nervous system. It's heartbreaking, I know. But Julian needs our focus right now. He's so weak, honey. He needs his wife." I want to see her, Dad. I want to tell her I love her." "Not yet, Sophie. The contamination. Her mind is a storm right now. You wouldn't recognize her. Let her rest. Let the bleach do its work." I wanted to scream. I wanted to howl until the foundations of the house shook. My own daughter was standing 10 feet above me, and she was being told that my love for her was a symptom of a psychotic break. The gaslighting was so absolute, so complete, that I felt a momentary surge of doubt. Was I crazy? Was I really sick? I looked at my hands in the dark, raw, red, and shaking. Arthur had used my own body against me. He had used the very rain of Seattle to make me feel like I was drowning in my own skin. But then I remembered the red patch on his neck. I remembered the lab report. I remembered the intimate whisper between him and Julian. I wasn't crazy. I was the only one in this house who was sane. The basement became my laboratory of observation. I didn't eat the protein bars. I didn't drink the water Arthur brought. I saved it, using the jugs to create a makeshift weight system to keep the laundry chute door slightly ajar so I could listen. I learned the rhythm of their lies. I heard Julian complaining about the side effects of his vitamins, which I knew were antiretrovirals. I heard Arthur coaching him on how to hide the night sweats from Sophie. But the most disturbing discovery came on the third night. Arthur came down to the basement. I hid behind the furnace, my breath held. He didn't come to see me. He went to the storage locker at the far end of the basement, a place where we kept old tax records and holiday decorations. He unlocked it with a key he kept on a silver chain. I watched from the shadows as he pulled out a medical cooler. He opened it, and the light from the locker reflected off a dozen glass vials. He took out 2 of them and a fresh syringe. He didn't look like a lawyer then. He looked like a man addicted to his own survival. He pulled up his sleeve, and even in the dim light, I saw it. His arm was a road map of bruises and needle marks. The rot wasn't just on his neck. It was everywhere. He injected himself with a practiced, desperate speed. When he was finished, he slumped against the storage locker, his eyes closed, his breathing a wet, ragged sound. "Damn you, Julian," he whispered into the darkness. "You were supposed to be the careful one. You were supposed to be the one who didn't get caught." He stayed there for a long time, a broken king in a kingdom of boxes. When he finally stood up, he looked around the utility room, his gaze lingering on the laundry chute. I squeezed myself tighter into the shadows, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He walked toward the stairs, but he stopped at my cot. He looked at the uneaten protein bars, and a flash of irritation crossed his face. "Eat, Clara," he muttered. "I need you strong enough to look the part of the crazy wife for a few more weeks. Just until the insurance is finalized. Just until we can leave this reign behind." Insurance. Leave. The pieces were clicking into place. Arthur was planning a disappearance. He was going to use my mental break as a cover to liquidate our assets and flee the city with Julian, leaving Sophie and me in the wreckage of his sterile lie. The enhyuknya of being used as a pawn in a financial exit strategy was the final straw. My life, my 30 years of devotion, my teaching career, my love for our daughter, it was all just domestic veneer for a man who was now injecting himself with stolen medicine in a basement storage locker. As he climbed the stairs and locked the door, I stepped out from behind the furnace. I didn't feel cold anymore. I felt a white-hot, incandescent rage. The basement was no longer a tomb. It was a vantage point. Arthur thought he had buried me, but he had actually given me the one thing he couldn't afford, a front-row seat to his downfall. He had forgotten that I knew the locker's code. He thought he had changed it, but Arthur was a man of patterns. He used the same numbers for everything. The year we bought this house, the year his pride was at its peak. I waited until I heard the house fall silent, until the rain turned into a soft, mocking drizzle. I walked to the storage locker. My hands didn't shake this time. I punched in the numbers. 1994. The lock clicked. I opened the door, and the smell of medicine and old paper hit me. I searched through the boxes, past the old tax returns and the dusty Christmas ornaments. I found it in a box labeled Client Files, Confidential. It wasn't just medical records, it was a ledger. Arthur was a real estate lawyer, but this ledger didn't track properties. It tracked investments in private clinics, offshore accounts, and a series of payments to a man named J.R. Julian. Arthur had been funding Julian's lifestyle for years. He had been grooming him, not as a son-in-law, but as a partner in a life of decadence that Sophie was never meant to see. And now, they were both dying from it. The ledger also contained Arthur's own medical history, a history of positive tests dating back 2 years. He had known long before Julian came into the picture. He had been infectious for 2 years, and he had been sleeping in the same bed as me until the day he moved me to the sunroom. He hadn't been protecting me from Julian. He had been hiding the fact that he was the one who had already brought the shadow into our bedroom. I fell to my knees in the cramped locker, the ledger clutched to my chest. The betrayal was so total, so absolute, that I felt like my soul was being torn out through my throat. Every kiss, every "I love you," every Sunday morning we spent drinking coffee and looking at the Seattle rain. It was all a performance by a man who was knowingly risking my life every single day. He had called me dirty. He had sprayed me with bleach. He had forced me to eat off paper plates because I was contaminated. The hypocrisy was a physical poison. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to lean against the locker door. Arthur was the contagion. Arthur was the rot. And he was using my daughter's love as a shield to hide his own monstrous nature. I looked at the ledger, the cold, hard numbers staring back at me. This was the key. This was the evidence that would shatter the sterile cage once and for all. But I was still in the basement. I was still a crazy woman with no Wi-Fi and a motion sensor on the stairs. I looked up at the laundry chute. It was a narrow, dark tunnel, but it led to the upper floors. It led to Sophie's room. I realized then that I didn't need to climb out. I just needed to send a message. I took a pen from the locker and a sheet of paper from an old tax return. I wrote one sentence, a sentence that I knew would cut through Arthur's lies like a diamond through glass. Sophie, look in the storage locker, code 1994. Look at the ledger. Look at your father's neck. He isn't protecting us. He's burying us. I folded the paper and tied it to the heaviest object I could find in the utility room, a silver spoon that had fallen through the chute weeks ago. I waited until I heard the soft hum of the laundry machine above, a sign that Sophie was doing the linens. I waited for the moment I heard the chute door open upstairs. With a strength born of pure desperation, I threw the spoon and the note up into the dark tunnel, hoping the fabric of the sheets would catch it, hoping the truth would finally find its way into the light. I heard a muffled clink as the spoon hit the metal, and then silence. I sank back onto the cot, the darkness of the basement closing in on me. The furnace hummed, and the water heater rattled. The frozen silence of the lower level felt different now. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the calm before the storm. I am Clara, and I am no longer waiting for the rain to stop. I am the one who is going to make it pour. The internal monologue in my head was a singular, focused flame. I thought of the wedding dress, the lilies, and the white lace. I thought of the red patch on Arthur's neck. I thought of my raw, red hands. The collapse was over. The reconstruction had begun. As I sat there in the dark, I heard a sound from the top of the stairs. It wasn't Arthur's heavy, commanding footsteps. It was a light, hesitant step. The door clicked open, and a sliver of light from the hallway spilled down into the darkness. "Mum?" The voice was a whisper, a question, a plea. I stood up, the ledger in my hand, my silhouette sharp against the light. The frozen silence was broken. The truth had started to breathe. And as the Seattle rain began to drum again on the basement windows, I realized that the sterile world Arthur had built was about to be washed away by a flood he couldn't control. I walked toward the light, my bare feet steady on the carpet. The cage was open. The storm was here. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being dirty. I was only afraid of staying silent. The light at the top of the stairs was blinding, but I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I kept walking, leaving the darkness of the basement behind me, leaving the plastic sheets and the smell of lemons. I was walking toward my daughter. I was walking toward the end of the lie. I am Clara, and the sterile cage is empty. The light from the top of the stairs didn't feel like salvation. It felt like an interrogation. I stood there, clutching the leather ledger to my chest as if it were a shield, watching my daughter's face flicker in the dim, yellow glow. Sophie looked so much like me when I was her age, with the same wide, trusting eyes and the same tendency to believe that the world was inherently good. But those eyes were now wide with a terror that made my stomach churn. She didn't come down. She just stood there, her hand hovering over the motion sensor Arthur had installed to keep me caged. "Mum, you shouldn't be out of bed," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a Seattle storm. "Dad said you were having a breakdown. He said you thought the walls were bleeding. The lies were so thick I could almost taste them. They tasted like the metallic tang of the bleach Arthur used to scrub my existence away." I took a step forward, my bare feet silent on the cold concrete. I didn't care about the sensor. I didn't care if the alarm went off and the men in white coats came to take me away. I only cared about the girl standing at the top of the stairs, the girl who was being fed poison by the man she called father. "Sophie, look at me," I said, my voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to the frantic monologue screaming in my head. "Do I look like I'm seeing ghosts? Or do I look like a woman who has finally seen the truth?" I held up the ledger. I held it into the sliver of light so she could see the gold-embossed initials of her father's firm. I saw her blink, her gaze shifting from my face to the book. She knew that ledger. Arthur kept it in his private safe, the one he said contained the blueprints of our future. "What is that doing down there?" she asked, her voice dropping to a frightened hum. "It was never meant for me to find, Sophie, and you were never meant to see what's inside. But the rain doesn't just wash things away, honey. Sometimes it floats the bodies to the surface." I heard a heavy footstep in the hallway above. Arthur. The sound of his dress shoes was a rhythmic thud that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins. He was coming. He always knew when the silence in the house had changed its frequency. "Mum, get back!" Sophie hissed, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "If he finds you out here—" "Close the door," I commanded, my voice a whip. "Close it, and don't let him see you talking to me. But take this." I reached up, stretching my arm as far as it would go, and shoved the ledger through the gap in the door just as she pulled it shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stood in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the muffled voices on the other side of the wood. "Sophie, what are you doing by the basement door?" Arthur's voice was smooth, but I could hear the jagged edge of suspicion underneath. "Nothing, Dad. I thought I heard her crying. It's hard to listen to," she lied. I felt a surge of pride. My daughter was learning to survive. Go back to Julian, Sophie. He needs his wife. Your mother is being handled. The air down there is stagnant. It's not good for your lungs. Go on now. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold wooden door. I was alone again, but the silence felt different. It felt like an alliance. I sat there for hours, listening to the house settle, listening to the rain turn into a rhythmic drumming against the small, high windows of the basement. I thought about the words in that ledger. The numbers were staggering. Arthur had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts and private medical facilities for years. Not just for Julian, for himself. The shared interests weren't just business deals. They were a lifestyle, a secret, dark curriculum that both men had been studying in the shadows of Seattle's high society. I thought about the red patch on Arthur's neck and the way he looked at Julian. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. They were the same. Two predators who had finally been caught in their own trap, and they were willing to sacrifice me and Sophie to keep the lights from shining on their rot. A few hours before dawn, a different sound pulled me out of my trance. It wasn't the heavy tread of my husband or the light step of my daughter. It was a rhythmic scratching at the basement window, the one hidden behind the overgrown hydrangea bushes. I crawled toward the sound, my knees scraping against the concrete. A face appeared in the glass, distorted by the rain and the shadows. It was a face I hadn't seen in 6 months. "Mrs. Gable," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. Mrs. Gable had been our housekeeper for 15 years. She was a woman from the Philippines who had seen every corner of our lives and never said a word, until the day Arthur fired her without warning or severance. He told me she was stealing. I had believed him. I had apologized to her with a check that she refused to take, her eyes full of a sorrow I didn't understand at the time. "Clara," she whispered, her voice muffled by the glass. "I saw the lights. I've been watching the house from the street. I knew he would do this to you eventually." "You knew?" I asked, my voice a choked sob. "He didn't fire me for stealing, Clara. He fired me because I found the phones, the ones he kept in the tool shed. I saw the messages. I saw where he was going when he said he was at the office." She reached through the narrow gap of the window, her hand holding a small silver object wrapped in plastic. "Take this," she said. "It's the burner phone I found in the shed before he kicked me out. I've kept it charged. The messages are all there. The names of the clinics. The names of the people Julian and Arthur were meeting at the hotels near the airport. He thinks I threw it in the Sound, but I knew you would need it one day." I took the phone, the cold metal feeling like a live wire in my hand. "Why are you helping me, Eleanor, after everything Arthur did to you?" "Because you were the only one who ever saw me as a person, Clara. And because no one should be buried alive in their own home." She disappeared into the fog of the Seattle night as quickly as she had appeared, leaving me with a small, glowing screen that contained the map of my husband's betrayal. I sat under the stairs, the only place where the motion sensors couldn't see me, and began to scroll. The messages were a descent into hell. There were dozens of them, dating back years. They spoke of secret meetings, of expensive treatments paid for in cash, and of a shared bank account that was used to fund a life of absolute decadence. But the most horrifying messages were the ones between Arthur and Julian. They weren't just business partners, they were a team. They had been frequenting the same underground clubs, the same private parties where the elite of the city went to disappear. One message from Arthur to Julian, sent 6 months ago, stood out like a bloodstain on white linen. The results came back. "We're both in the red. Don't tell Sophie. Don't tell Clara." We need to finalize the insurance policies before the symptoms become visible. If the wives find out, we lose everything. The insurance policies. I remembered Arthur sitting at the kitchen table 3 months ago, telling me we needed to update our life insurance to ensure Sophie's inheritance. He had been so convincing, so protective. I had signed the papers without even reading them, trusting the man who had promised to cherish me until death. He had known then. He had known he was sick, and he had been planning his exit strategy, a strategy that involved me being declared mentally unfit so he could take full control of the funds. He hadn't been spraying me with bleach to keep me clean. He had been doing it to create a record of my breakdown. The protein bars, the paper plates, the basement quarantine. It was all evidence for a court of law to show that I was a danger to myself. He was killing my reputation so he could live on my sacrifice. The financial figures in the messages were sickening. $400,000 for a private clinic in Switzerland. $200,000 in hush money to a former driver. And then there were the policies. If Arthur died, or if he disappeared, the payout was $900,000. Every cent of it was tied to my silence. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of nhuknya. I had been so proud of our life. I had walked through the streets of Seattle with my head held high, thinking I was part of something honorable. I had been a teacher, a woman who valued the truth above all else, and I had been living in a house built on a foundation of lies and infectious shadows. I felt like I wanted to peel my own skin off, to wash away the 30 years I had spent being a domestic veneer for a monster. But then I thought of Sophie. I looked up at the ceiling, at the floorboards that separated me from my daughter. She was upstairs, probably reading that ledger, her world shattering just like mine had. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a witness. The internal monologue in my head shifted from a fractured loop to a war cry. I wasn't going to wait for the rain to stop. I was going to use the rain. I was going to use the burner phone and the ledger to build a case that even Arthur's expensive law firm couldn't touch. I spent the rest of the night transcribing the messages onto the back of the tax forms I had found in the locker. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a diamond. I recorded every clinic, every date, every dollar amount. I was building a map of the rot. Around 4 in the morning, the furnace kicked on with a roar that vibrated through my bones. The heat was stifling, a dry, artificial warmth that made the smell of the basement even more unbearable. I heard footsteps again. Arthur was coming down. I quickly hid the burner phone and my notes inside an old, hollowed-out Christmas decoration box and sat on the cot, pulling the scratchy blanket over my legs. I forced my face into a mask of hollow-eyed despair, the role he had written for me. The door opened, and the light from the hallway spilled down the stairs. Arthur was holding a plastic tray. On it was a single cup of black coffee and a bowl of oatmeal that looked like grey paste. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes deeper than they had been the day before. The red patch on his neck was now a dark, angry purple. "Eat," he said, his voice flat. "You look like you've been up all night talking to yourself again." The sensors showed a lot of movement, Clara. "I was just trying to stay warm, Arthur," I whispered, playing the part. "It's so cold down here. The rain. It sounds like people screaming." He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That's the psychosis talking. You need to focus on being quiet. Sophie is worried about you, but I told her you were resting. She doesn't need to see you in this state." "How is Julian?" I asked, my voice trembling. "He's a survivor," Arthur said, his eyes flashing with a strange, dark intensity. "He's doing what needs to be done. Unlike you, he understands the value of discretion." Arthur stepped closer to the cot, and for a second, I thought he was going to touch me. I felt a surge of pure physical revulsion. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I knew about the tool shed, about Eleanor, about the $900,000. But I stayed silent. I stayed in the cage. He looked at me for the long moment, then turned and walked back toward the stairs. "Don't touch the tray when you're done," he said over his shoulder. "I'll come down and disinfect the area later." I watched him go, the sound of the lock clicking back into place. I didn't touch the oatmeal. I didn't drink the coffee. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade away. Then I went back to the tool shed phone. I had an ally now. Eleanor was on the outside. Sophie was on the inside. And I was the thread that connected them. The thread was thin, and it was fragile, but it was made of the truth, and the truth is the only thing that doesn't melt in the rain. I looked at the silver spoon I had thrown up the laundry chute. It was gone. Sophie had taken it. She had taken the note. The first crack in the glass was no longer a hope. It was a reality. As the sun began to rise over Seattle, casting a pale grey light through the basement windows, I realized that the sterile cage was no longer a place of death. It was a place of preparation. I thought of the wedding dress again, but this time I didn't see the lace. I saw the stains. I saw the rot that had been there all along, hidden behind the lilies and the champagne. The U-shape of my journey was beginning its upward climb. I was still in the basement, still cold, still raw. Nhưng tôi đã không còn là người phụ nữ bị ruồng bỏ nữa. Tôi là người nắm giữ mật mã. Tôi là người sở hữu chiếc điện thoại bí mật. The internal monologue in my head was a steady, rhythmic beat. Arthur had spent 30 years building a house of cards, and he thought he could use a bottle of bleach to keep it from falling. He thought he could use the silence of a basement to bury a wife who knew too much. But he forgot that I had spent my life teaching my students how to read between the lines. And between the lines of our life, I had found the story of a man who was terrified of the dark. I am Clara, and I am no longer afraid of the shadows. I am the one who is going to turn on the lights. The rain against the window sounded like applause. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the cold concrete wall, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The battle for my home, for my daughter, and for my dignity was just beginning, but for the first time, I knew I was going to win. Because no matter how much disinfectant Arthur used, he could never wash away the blood on his hands. The hidden key wasn't a piece of metal. It was the realization that I was stronger than the lie. I looked at the burner phone, its small screen glowing in the dark. It was my link to the world, my invisible thread of hope. I had the clinics. I had the ledger. I had the messages. All I needed now was the right moment to pull the thread and watch the whole, sterile world of Arthur and Julian unravel into the grey Seattle mist. I tucked the phone back into the Christmas box and sat on my cot, waiting for the sound of the laundry machine above, waiting for the next message from my daughter, waiting for the storm to break. The house was silent, but it wasn't a frozen silence anymore. It was the silence of a fuse burning toward a barrel of gunpowder, and I was the one holding the match. The basement door didn't just open, it shivered. It was the sound of a foundation cracking under the weight of a 30-year-old lie. Sophie stood there, her silhouette a jagged line against the clinical white light of the hallway above. She held the ledger I had shoved through the door like it was a piece of burning coal, her fingers trembling so violently that the gold-embossed edges caught the light in frantic staccato flashes. I walked up the stairs slowly, my bare feet reclaiming each step, ignoring the hum of the motion sensors and the imaginary boundaries Arthur had drawn in the dust. My heart wasn't hammering anymore. It was a cold, steady drum, beating out a rhythm of war. "Mom," Sophie whispered, and the word was a ragged sob. Why is Dad's name on these clinic receipts? Why is Julian's signature next to a payout for a woman in Tacoma? The rain against the siding sounded like 1,000 fingers trying to claw their way inside. I reached the top step and looked at my daughter. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, sickening clarity. She had looked into the abyss, and for the first time, she saw that the abyss was wearing her father's face. Before I could answer, the heavy click of Arthur's dress shoes echoed from the study. He appeared behind Sophie, his presence a dark, suffocating shroud. He looked at the ledger in her hand, then at me, standing on the threshold of my prison, and the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "Sophie, give me that," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "Your mother is in a state of crisis. She's manipulating you with forged documents. She's trying to destroy this family because she can't handle her own decline." "You're the one who's declining, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through his lawyer talk like a shard of ice. I didn't scream. I didn't need to. The truth has its own volume. I reached into the pocket of my nightgown and pulled out the silver burner phone Eleanor had given me. The screen was glowing, a small, digital ghost in the hallway. "I found the phones, Arthur. I found the messages. I know about the hotel near the airport. I know about the shared interests you and Julian have been chasing in the dark." Arthur's face turned a shade of grey that matched the Seattle sky. He took a step towards me, his gloved hand reaching for the phone, but Sophie stepped between us. She wasn't the fragile gallery owner anymore. She was a woman whose sanctuary had been violated. She looked at the red, angry patch on Arthur's neck, the one he had tried so hard to hide beneath his silk collars, and I saw her recoil as if she had been struck. "It's true, isn't it?" she breathed, her voice thick with revulsion. "The exhaustion, the quarantine. It wasn't about Mum. It was about you. Both of you." Julian emerged from the shadows of the master bedroom, leaning against the doorframe for support. He looked like a hollowed-out version of the man who had stood at the altar 3 years ago. His expensive cashmere sweater hung off his sallow frame, and his eyes were rimmed with a desperate, animal fear. He looked at Arthur, seeking a lie, seeking a way out, but Arthur was staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. "We were protecting you," Julian blurted out, his voice cracking. "Sophie, your father and I, we didn't want you to carry this burden. We were managing it. The insurance, it was for your future." "The insurance?" I repeated, stepping into the hallway, my bare feet finally touching the hardwood Arthur had forbidden me to tread upon. $900,000, Arthur. That's what my life is worth to you. You were going to let me rot in a state facility, labeled as a madwoman, just so you could cash out and disappear with your partner in rot. The silence that followed was a frozen thing, a clinical vacuum where the smell of bleach seemed to intensify until it was choking us all. Arthur looked at the house he had built, the mahogany, the silver, the plastic sheets, and he saw it for what it was, a tomb. He lunged for the burner phone, his refined grace replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. He was a man drowning, and he was trying to pull me under with him, but I was no longer the woman who apologized for taking up space. I dodged him, the adrenaline making my movements fluid and sharp. I threw the phone to Sophie. "Call Eleanor," I told her. "The contact is under Gable. She has the rest of the records. She has the names of the drivers. She has the truth that your father fired her to hide." "Dad, stop!" Sophie screamed as Arthur tried to grab her arm. Her voice was a jagged glass edge, and for the first time in his life, Arthur flinched. He stopped, his chest heaving, the purple patch on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of his frantic heart. He looked at his daughter, the legacy he claimed to protect, and he saw the absolute, unmitigated contempt in her gaze. It was a purge of a different kind, not of germs, but of the soul. The confrontation moved to the living room, beneath the vaulted ceilings and the expensive art that now looked like the spoils of a war crime. The rain was a deafening roar now, a relentless drumbeat against the glass walls. I stood in the center of the room, the woman they had called dirty, the woman they had treated like a contagion. I looked at Arthur, standing by the fireplace, his hands shaking in their blue latex gloves. He looked small. He looked like a man made of paper, waiting for the rain to melt him away. "I'm going to the police," Sophie said, her voice cold and dead. "I'm going to every gallery, every firm, every person who ever looked up to you. I'm going to tell them that you turned our home into a laboratory of deception. I'm going to tell them that you used a virus as a weapon to silence my mother. You'll destroy everything," Julian whimpered, sinking into one of the plastic-covered chairs. "The firm, the reputation. Sophie, we'll have nothing." "We already have nothing, Julian," she replied, her eyes flashing with a fury I had never seen. "We have a house full of bleach and 2 dying men who sold their souls for a secret. I'd rather be a pauper than spend another second breathing the air you've poisoned." Arthur tried one last time to use his power. He straightened his charcoal jacket, trying to summon the authority of the courtroom. "Clara, think about what you're doing. The legal ramifications. The scandal. It will follow you too. You'll be the wife of a disgraced man. Is that the legacy you want?" "My legacy is the truth, Arthur," I said, and the internal monologue in my head finally fell silent, replaced by a profound, echoing peace. "I spent 30 years being your legacy. I spent 30 years being the domestic veneer for your ambition. I'm done. I don't care about the scandal. I don't care about the firm. I only care about the fact that I can finally touch the walls of my own house without feeling like I'm a sin." I walked over to the mahogany shelf and picked up a crystal vase, a wedding gift from my parents. I felt the weight of it, the cold, sharp edges of the glass. I looked Arthur in the eye, and then I let it go. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, 1,000 sparkling diamonds of defiance. Arthur flinched as if a bullet had passed through him. The purge continued. Sophie began tearing down the plastic sheets, her movements frantic and liberating. She ripped the shrouds off the sofas, the chairs, the paintings. The house was being unmasked, layer by layer, until the clinical white world Arthur had created was gone, replaced by the raw, messy reality of our broken lives. "Get out," Sophie told Julian, pointing to the mudroom door. "Take your briefcase. Take your vitamins. Just get out." Julian looked at Arthur, but the older man was staring at the floor, his spirit finally broken by the weight of his own hypocrisy. Julian grabbed his things and stumbled toward the door, his cough rattling through the foyer one last time before the Seattle rain swallowed him whole. Then it was just the 3 of us, the father, the mother, and the daughter. The triangle of our life now collapsed into a straight line of truth. Arthur looked at me, and for the first time in decades, I saw the man behind the lawyer. He looked terrified. He looked like a child afraid of the dark. "I gave you everything," he whispered, his voice a pathetic, wheezing sound. "You gave me a cage," I replied. "And you called it a castle." The purge of Arthur was silent. He didn't fight anymore. He didn't spray the air. He just walked to the master bedroom and closed the door. It wasn't the commanding click of a master. It was the soft thud of a man retreating into the only prison he had left, his own body. Sophie came to me then. She didn't stay 3 feet away. She didn't wear gloves. She threw her arms around me and buried her face in my shoulder, her sobs echoing through the empty, unmasked living room. I held her, my raw red hands stroking her hair. The scent of bleach was still there, but beneath it, I could smell the rain, the real rain, the one that cleanses the earth before the spring. We stayed like that for a long time, two women in a house of ghosts. I felt the U-shape of my journey reaching its peak, the descent into the basement, the frozen silence of the quarantine, the enhuk nya of being labelled a contagion. It was all behind me now. I had reached the point of confrontation, and the purge was complete. The villains hadn't been defeated by a court of law. They had been defeated by the sheer, unyielding weight of the truth. As the first light of dawn began to grey the Seattle sky, I looked around the living room. The plastic sheets were in a heap on the floor. The crystal was shattered. The air purifier was silent. The house felt huge, and it felt empty, but for the first time in months, it felt clean. Arthur remained in the bedroom. He wouldn't leave for days, not until the lawyers and the doctors arrived to finalize the wreckage. But in that moment, he didn't matter. He was just a footnote in a story that finally belonged to me. I am Clara, and I am the master of this house. The internal monologue in my head was a soft, steady hum. I thought of the wedding dress again, but this time, the lace didn't look like a shroud. It looked like a discarded skin. We were going to leave this place. We were going to sell the mahogany and the silver and the Queen Anne prestige. We were going to find a small place by the Sound, where the air was salty and the truth didn't need to be sprayed with disinfectant. Sophie pulled away and looked at me, her eyes red but clear. "What do we do now, Mum?" "We breathe," I said. "We breathe the air, Sophie. And then we start over." The purge was a fire, and it had burned away the domestic veneer, the lies, and the sterile cages. What was left was the two of us, scarred but whole, standing in the ruins of a perfect family. The rain against the glass was no longer a haunting. It was a washing. The ghosts were gone. The bleach was fading. I looked out at the Space Needle, its spire piercing through the morning fog. Seattle was waking up, a city of 1,000,000 stories, and I finally had mine back. The Nuknya had been a catalyst, a bitter medicine that had forced me to open my eyes. Arthur and Julian were the ones who were infectious, but they couldn't touch me anymore. I am Clara, and I am alive. The silence of the house was no longer frozen. It was expectant. It was the silence between the acts of a play, the moment before the curtain rises on a new scene. I walked to the kitchen and picked up a real glass, a heavy crystal tumbler. I filled it with water from the tap and drank it down, the cold liquid a benediction in my throat. I didn't worry about the germs. I didn't worry about the contamination. I only worried about the future. And for the first time in 30 years, the future didn't look like a grey smudge in the rain. It looked like a clear, bright line on the horizon. The purge was over. The truth was breathing. And beneath the slate roof of our Queen Anne home, the mother and the daughter began to plan their escape from the shadows. We would leave the masks behind. We would leave the bleach behind. We would walk out into the Seattle rain, and we wouldn't care if we got wet. Because the rain of the truth is the only thing that can truly make you clean.